Hello everyone, my name is Esteban Rodriguez, and today I'm going to be reviewing the new TV miniseries adaptation of the iconic Peter Schaffer play, Amadeus. Now, just as I said that information, and even before that, as you clicked on this video, you probably have at least three of these thoughts in your mind. One, you've never even heard of this show before. Two, who in the right mind would even make another version of this play after the 1984 Oscar-winning Amadeus film by Milos Forman? And three, why and fuck did I watch this? All very valid ideas and thoughts for sure. And I will try to explain all those in a moment. But first, I think I definitely need to acknowledge that, if people were to see this show, that yes, this isn't just a full-on remake of the Amadeus film by Milos Forman, but it's more simply just another adaptation of the play by Peter Schaffer. And as much as people will immediately see this from the trailers and from other promotional materials, they'll immediately write it off. And I definitely had my reservations when I first heard of it. But I will acknowledge that, I think that it was already an interesting idea to have this new adaptation be a miniseries. Because I think that if you are to do different adaptations of one particular story, I think it would be quite interesting to go the route of having each adaptation be of a different medium. So you could see how that medium can adapt the source material into something that's its own structure, its own form of storytelling, and the different ways that you can present things either visually, like sonically, or on the page. So with all that in mind, that's definitely the one thing I say that has been a slight, optimistic thought I had when I went into the show. Because bear in mind, that's definitely the main reason why. So, yeah. If you obviously couldn't tell, if you haven't been closely following my channel or closely following my work, or even just have known me personally, have gotten to know me, you can probably tell that not only do I love classical music, but when it comes to Mozart in particular, ever since I was a small little kid, I had been obsessed with Mozart. Absolutely obsessed with Mozart. He's probably my favorite artist who ever lived. And to me, he's like the pinnacle of what any artist could possibly achieve in any medium, in any form of arts. He was just this it's like almost this form of energy that can simultaneously balance between multiple genres, between multiple emotions, and manage to be so unique and transcend any form of restriction of the natural world that he might have had and make something that is just universal. Whenever I listen to his music, simply put, whenever I listen to his music, especially if it's meant to make you happy, just hearing his melodies, hearing his style makes me feel a sense of joy and wonder beyond any comprehension. So that is definitely my bias when it comes to Mozart. However, I also see how if you're doing stories about classical composers, it is a very difficult thing to do, really, because at this point, classical music and the composers has been almost as revered as in Greek mythology, Greek gods were revered. Very much so. We see these individuals that create all these masterpieces as higher above all of us, because especially with Mozart, there is the myth of the child prodigy and of the one that was able to just immediately think of a masterpiece just in his head and write it all down in one night, which a lot of that is actually historically accurate. That is what we know, at least in the documents. And we can obviously tell just by listening to his music that it's still relevant and it's still impactful to so many people today. But when it comes to portraying any composer in a narrative, you think to yourself, how can you portray a genius in comparison to the rest of the world? How can you make that impactful? So that's actually going to be a challenge if you're ever dealing with classical music because of the ubiquity of so many artists that clearly were beyond talented. And you had ideas like the Peter Schaffer play, and then what happened with Milos Forman's film in particular, like that showed Mozart very well. And you had stuff oh yeah, Anthony Burgess's like Mozart and the Wolfgang, which is sort of like a Shakespearean like kind of like satirical approach to Mozart's life, where it's just other composers from heaven, like Greek mythology, looking down at his whole life and seeing how like masters look at an upcoming master. And it's this weird thing. It's a very odd book, a very underrated piece by Burgess that showed how he was definitely someone that always was trying to cross the boundaries of literature. But now we have this new adaptation, which is something that now, having seen all 5 episodes, I have a lot of thoughts, even though it's a weird one where I definitely have many thoughts I can say about it, even though by the end, the best way to describe this entire show is just a kind of by the numbers, very dull approach to the source material. So, if you're not familiar with the actual story of the play, I'll give a brief synopsis of just the overall story. So, what usually happens in each story is that this is a tale told by Antonio Salieri, a contemporary of Mozart's, who we usually start the story way into the future, way many years after this takes place, where Salieri is now this jaded old man, way past his prime, very much almost forgotten by most people, and is at that time when Mozart is becoming more and more revered year by year. And Salieri decided to tell a story either through us, the audience, or in the film, a priest, or in this show, which we'll get to actually. So yeah, there's always this framing device of Salieri telling the story in a way that it's through his perspective, his lens of seeing the young Mozart come into his prime and making his best, most known works through particularly operas and concertos and symphonies. And it is that jealousy that Salieri feels that makes him slowly but surely, resent everything from his religious background and vows to destroy Mozart in any way that he can. So that's the overall idea. It's definitely something where if you actually look up the history of it, the concept of Salieri murdering Mozart, literally is entirely fictional. That's how it was if anyone you slice it. It's just something that feels oddly like implausible. Like there's no possible way. And the thing I'll say about that is, or how I'll defend it, is that the play and just the overall story, it is just a reinterpretation of history. It simply is just historical fiction. And it makes for something where that when you have a story there is this like universality of combining this idea of two opposite extremes of the sacred and the secular, someone who is more sophisticated versus someone who's very childish. And it is that contrast, it is that absolute opposites of personality that the story plays with in both Mozart and Salieri. And it is a dynamic that is exaggerated to make such a very unique, compelling drama that, in many ways, is something that still stays relevant to this day. Now, also, what I'll say about the whole Mozart and Salieri thing is that it's kind of fascinating how from my interpretation of the story, both in like the play, the film, even in this miniseries, which again I'll get to, what I think about with that play is that I think people forget that even in the story, like the writers and the creators aren't fully saying that what Salieri is doing is factually correct. That yes, he did kill Mozart. Because like the whole framing device of Salieri telling the story is shown that it's very subjective. That because we are viewing Salieri's story, the story that we're seeing is always going to be so fictitious in some form that we're already not supposed to fully trust it, because you can only believe a person so much. And that's the main source of greatness that was found in especially the Schaffer play, where he allowed for Salieri to be our window, but also he is somewhat of an unreliable narrator. It's up for us to decide how much of it we believe and how much of it is completely fabricated. Because I think that like the stories like that it's telling is fully aware of the rumor, and it plays around with the idea that it could be true, it could be completely false. It's up for us to decide. It's never really something that is set in stone. But yeah, and I'm pretty sure most people would just look at Salieri as just like a crazy person. Like, how the hell could you possibly like think this? And how possibly, like, why would you even try and kill yourself because of, quote, the guilt you feel for killing Mozart? So with all that being said, with all these ideas of fabrication and historical fiction and the contrasting between characters, and of now seeing an adaptation of exploring how taking something from stage to the screen represents new challenges, when it comes to the miniseries, admittedly, I think that it's a show that definitely tries to have its own unique spin on the original story. And the main way it does this is how, instead of being fully a story in the perspective of Salieri, it tries to be a dyad, more of a dyad, despite the fact it still keeps the framing device. But with this new structure, it's sort of a unique dyad of it's both Mozart and Salieri's story. We see more and more that Mozart and Salieri have their own strengths and weaknesses that are purely exploited. And, it is that classic idea of two sides of the same coin. And that's the main thing that the series tries to do, which again, I think it's kind of odd that it didn't play advantage of the fact that it is a television episodic series, where, with an episodic series, you could really play around with the idea of one episode being from one person's perspective, or another episode being from another person's perspective, and stuff like that, or having it be a way of being very episodic in the sense of like one moment is just one moment, and like one historic period is just for this one episode, and so on and so on. They definitely don't really play around with the whole structure of what you can do with an episodic series, which is definitely a bit of a disappointment. But as it stands, it's something that is perfectly serviceable, and for the most part, for the first couple episodes, because I would say like the first two episodes are where the show is at its highest potential. We start off, and even though I don't really like the framing device, where here's the difference. So whereas we see the play is just Salieri talking to the audience, and in the Foreman film, Salieri is talking to a priest. Salieri in the miniseries tells the story to an elder Costanza, Mozart's former wife, the widow, which is a very odd choice, and it's one that I think kind of feels so just phoned in, really. The whole framing device just feels very phoned in this, because when you actually watch the main story of Mozart and Salieri, it's shown that there's not really a need to cut back to these narrations, and how there's no sense of Salieri always narrating the story, as the story that we're seeing on screen is playing on. It's more of just interludes where, oh, all of a sudden now we have to come back to the present day with Salieri and Costanza. It's a very, very odd choice. And Costanza as a character, what I will say about that is that Costanza, I think those two like aren't really shown to have a dynamic that makes sense for this to be part of the framing device. Whereas I do think Costanza by herself, when she is by herself as a character and with Mozart is actually somewhat interesting. That's definitely a big change that they have in the show, is that Costanza is a bigger player than she was, at least in the Milos Forman film. Because here we actually get to see her as an aria singer, which is actually who she was in real life. And we see how both of them as artists are connecting in a strong way, that we see how, because Mozart, of course, has his eccentricities and is really terrible with money, it does frustrate Costanza, because she's someone that's like basically the one always trying to balance being an artist but also being a housewife and stuff like that. And that aspect and that dynamic, I thought, was the one unique thing that I think adds to the story in a way that doesn't feel like, oh, we have to, quote, make the woman in the story feel more important in that type of like modern sense of progressive storytelling, which like it usually doesn't fully annoy me, fine with that. But again, it's just, I think that the way they did it was like solid. And while we're on this topic of that, I guess we should talk about both the performances and the characters of Mozart and Salieri. We'll start off with Mozart, because I think for me and most people, this was definitely a controversial idea of how you have Will Sharp, who is half Japanese, playing Mozart. And I'll get to that aspect of the story later on. But as for Mozart, I was actually quite surprised by him, and I appreciated the turn that Sharp took with the character, because here he's playing a Mozart who definitely is quite vulgar, definitely is someone that is portrayed with a bit of like a very like crass but very comedic approach, but it's not done in a similarly cartoonish way as what Tom Hulce did in the Foreman film. Here, it's almost like he's trying to be a bit more down to earth, where especially as he's performing and composing and showing off his musical skills, he seems like he has a level of sophistication and care for what he does, and especially when it comes to his music, there is also a sense of him having a bit of this ego. Funny how it's like I just because I watched this, like Mozart in this show, like at this point, has elements that remind me of Marty Mauser from Marty Supreme more than like actual Mozart, because there are some scenes later on where Mozart becomes so egotistical that he kind of just pushes people away and it humiliates people in a way that feels so out of left field. But yeah, that's odd. But like besides like the writing of the character, I really appreciate the performance of Will Sharp. I thought he played the character quite well, and it was one that felt unique to him and didn't just feel like a replication of what Tom Hulse did with like his very much his infamous laugh, the way he moves, his like the costumes that he has. It's something where he definitely played to his own strengths, and I appreciate that. Now, with Paul Bettany on the other hand, as Salieri, that's where I get more mixed on it, because I mean, for one, it is kind of hard when you have to compare any performance of this character with F. Murray Abraham's portrayal, because to me, that is one of the greatest performances given by an actor in any film. I think what Abraham did in the Amadeus film by Foreman is extraordinary. I think it's really is a performance, not just the fact that, in the present day sequences, he has so much makeup and is able to fully disappear, and it feels like a true sense of an aging man that we see, in his prime, and seeing the contrast of that. It's the way that he is able to so perfectly convey the deceptions of being an ally towards Mozart, while later on in other scenes showing his true self without really needing to have much dialogue being said. And like you have so much of this character that has moments of joy and sadness, frustration, anger, fear, that all come in so brilliantly in a way that it would be hard for anyone to do that, because Salieri is a very unique character in the play, and he really is the driving force behind making the story work. And unfortunately, the biggest sin that Bettany does is that he plays the role in a very flat manner. Unfortunately, it is this sense where there isn't that much contrast, and it feels so unconvincing the way that he portrays specific emotions, particularly in the last episode, of this forced sense of trying to get in those tears, like trying to express that sadness. It just comes across as always so wooden. And, I don't really think Bettany is, a bad actor. I think he's fine. He can be a solid actor if he really puts his mind to it. I just don't think his interpretation of Salieri really paid off in the way that I think he intended it to be. So it's a weird mix of performances, really, and it comes across in a show that definitely is trying to be more of a contemporary telling. Because something that I mentioned earlier that has been a bit of a controversy is, why make Mozart Japanese? Well, because the thing that this show does is that, like it seems like it's going to be a trend for a while, is that like many modern period pieces that come out in media, it's done with a mixed race mentality, where we completely disregard the idea of racial and gender roles within most of the high society that these stories take place in, and just you can just basically have blacks and Asians and people of all different types of colors and different cultures just coming around, and it doesn't really matter like that they are like what they are. It's just that's how, like that's the world that we create. And to me, like, I don't really have an issue with that. Again, this has been around for so long. It's like you can look back to stuff like even to Jesus Christ Superstar, or more recently with Hamilton or Bridgerton, which, I have my thoughts on how those are, which I'll display here. But as for Amadeus, you know, like it's so obviously so easy for so many reviews to point this out and say it as a flaw, as something that is sacrilegious, and how dare you not go and stay true to actual history rather than just make up your own shit. And although, again, like, to me, what really, really was so odd about this is how, if you actually watch the show, most of the time, again, it doesn't really matter. And I feel like its approach to this mixed race casting doesn't really change that much of how we perceive the story. It's just there just as something that is just seen as clearly just popular because, oh, Bridgerton and Hamilton did it, so let's do it again. And at least with Hamilton's case, it does, no matter how you feel about that show, it is a story where, it takes this idea of the founding fathers, and with its mixed race casting shows that the story of leaders and the story of friendship and love is a universal matter that transcends all cultures. And it creates this very like sentimental portrayal of these types of thematics, and uses the idea of people that, regardless of color or ethnicity or race, to just show that this is just a world and a story that we see time and time again of friends and family and society that will always be a part of it. Whereas with the Amadeus show, there's not really anything it's doing in a strong way to show how, quote, universal it is. The only time that it was quite humorous to see a mixed race casting was the black guy that played Lorenzo da Ponte, which I that is funny because like not to act like I'm some sort of like a social justice warrior or type of person like that gets easily like like a snowflake, but I just want to say that it's very funny that the only central character, like, or also like Emmanuel like what was that guy's name, like, yeah, like Susumaya. Like those both Susumaya and Lorenzo da Ponte are both played by black people. And I just want to say that it is quite humorous. No, scratch that. It's just very morbidly ironic that the two central black actors in the show that have the most dialogue and the most amount of character in the show, they are playing characters that, one, you have Lorenzo da Ponte, who was this giant womanizer scoundrel that was in a scandal involving a minor. And then you have Schikaneder, who in this show is just basically a double agent for Salieri and is only there just to serve his means. Like, again, I'm not going to say that, they did something terrible, because that's for the people that care about the stuff, want to talk about it. It's just very ironic that you try to be progressive with your casting, and these are the characters you give to black people. Not saying that I'm going to go up in arms about it. I'm just pointing it out there. And ultimately, I just think it's just funny from a perspective of laughing at the people who fucking decided to make this mixed race into all the freaking producers and studios that are behind this shit. Great job. Progressive industry we are. We are so progressive. So anyways, with that debacle out the way, the reason why I'm just talking a lot about this, because, I mean, for one, there's not really that much like difference in terms of most of the story playing out, despite these things I've mentioned so far. Like, these are like the outliers in an adaptation that very much so goes by the numbers. Like, you get all the same classical tracks of both Salieri and Mozart for the most part. You see the story play out. You see Noci di Figaro being made. You see Don Giovanni being made. You see Mozart's relationship with his father for one episode, which is another part where I think that was easily the strongest episode in the show, because episode 2 focuses the most on Mozart and his dynamic with his father in a way that, it wasn't as powerful as in the film, but it was a solid enough attempt. You have all this and that, and not much is really showing a sense of change until we get to the final episode. Now, with this final episode, I want to do something where I'm going to spoil what happens at this ending, because I think it's the funniest shit ever. And so, for all those people that for some reason want to watch the Amadeus show, definitely click off now, because I'm going to spoil the final episode. Okay, so this is basically where I went from being so like indifferent and meh about the show to then it actively pissing me off. So let's talk about this. Okay. So in the final episode, we get introduced to a new second framing device for absolutely no reason. So along with Salieri telling the story of the Costanza, we had to cut to 6 years after Salieri's death, where we meet an aging Costanza in her house, and she gets a knock on the door by someone who wants to speak to her. Now, this person who knocks at her door is a man named Alexander Pushkin. Now, if you're familiar with playwright history, or even familiar just with the history of Amadeus, then you'll know him as the playwright who wrote the original Mozart and Salieri play that Peter Schaffer based his play on. And so already you're starting to see a little bit of where this is going to go. So later on in the episode, Pushkin asked her about the narrative that Salieri told her about his experiences with Mozart, because he wants to write a play about it, and he wants her approval to see if this story is true or not. Thus, he'll write it down. Now, that's what happens in the beginning, and the final episode mainly focuses on the premiere of the Magic Flute and Mozart getting sick and getting, like, quote, poisoned by Salieri and dying and stuff like that. Which, I will say, I'm going to bring up another thing now that we're on this episode. The only thing I actually kind of liked and thought was decent about this episode was the scene when Mozart is in bed laying with Salieri. Now, of course, if you've seen the film, you'll know the very iconic scene of Mozart and Salieri together while Mozart is very ill, and they're both collaborating to write the Requiem. Now, like, this is such a famous scene. It's weird how throughout the show they replicate stuff like the whole when Salieri first sees Mozart in like some ball, or moments like that are just like meant to just be pale imitations of the movie. But it's interesting how arguably the most famous scene in the film they decided just, okay, we know we can't just replicate that. So they decided to do something different. And this is something that is the one other thing that I did kind of appreciate about the show, is that what this show does, like the best, different, unique thing that this show does on a thematic level, is fully acknowledge the differences between Mozart and Salieri in terms of their beliefs in what they are doing. Whereas Salieri is a very religious, very orthodox person that fully believes in the divine and the transcendental. Mozart, despite the fact that he has written some stuff that is for masses and choirs, and just his music sounds so good that it only could come from God. When he describes his music, he describes it as just something that is just very technical. He has no thoughts of the divine. He has no thoughts of having to be someone that is, a gift from God. He is just a composer. He just enjoys what he does as just music. And that's a conversation that happens a few times throughout the show between Salieri and Mozart, which comes to a head in this scene where I do like how more, much like in the play, Salieri basically kind of reveals a lot of his honest thoughts to Mozart rather than him just composing the Requiem with him, as in the Foreman film. And in this show, Salieri basically commits to being very vulnerable. And, with this version, he realizes that to him, he will always be a form of mediocrity in comparison to him. And he's begging Mozart, like at this form, like at this state of his life, he begs him to give him the answers as to how he can become as great as him. And of course, Mozart can't give him the answers because there is none. Like, he can't just give his gift of talent to anybody, of course. And what I like about this scene the most is emphasizing a key aspect of the dynamic, which is Mozart feels absolutely no resentment or jealousy towards Salieri. Of course, because of his deception, but Mozart genuinely thought of Salieri as a friend. And despite the fact that he may sometimes make fun of his work, he does have sincere respect for him, which is something that I think really touches Salieri and realizes maybe what he's been doing for all these years must have been a mistake, or might have been a mistake. And so, in a unique twist of events, Mozart becomes the one to exalt Salieri and basically, for a moment, decides to ask God to somewhat forgive him, and, like, in an almost spiritual sense, like, even if he doesn't know it, he's forgiving Salieri. And I love how the music that plays over that is Salieri's Requiem, not Mozart's, which I think is a very, very touching decision that I think says a lot, and I really appreciate that moment. It was nice. Okay, now for why the rest of this episode is absolute dog shit. So, with this episode, it continues the framing devices of two framing devices, and the episode plays out now, and by the end, we get to the ending where here the show decides to emphasizes Salieri's pittiness, where all he wants is to basically have fame. And the real reason why he basically like did all this, like, of this lie of like this potential fabricated story of Mozart is just for him to just be remembered. He's so desperate to have some sort of fame, which is like there's always been a part of the character as we see in old age where he thinks about his legacy and what he means. Like in the film, he constantly says to God, like, make me immortal. I want to be remembered even after I die. He so desperately wants to be remembered. And like, of course, he does get remembered in the worst possible way ever as the possible murderer of Mozart. But I always find that there was some semblance of dignity in the way that he saw it, where he decides to instead be someone as a representative, a vessel for all those, quote, the mediocrities of life that are now absolved of their sins by Salieri and being a representation of that. And the show instead just focuses on him just being a loser, basically. Just being someone that, and as we see throughout the show, it's like, oh, he does the similar things that Mozart does and yada, 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 which to me, that's just a weird way to portray his character in how, oh, he's just someone that's just a loser that just wanted fame and it's just like a kooky old man now. Like I get it. He's the antagonist, and this is like, quote, a defeat of the antagonist from Costanza. That like she says a line, I think, where it's like, Mozart will always be remembered, and you will never be forgotten, or something like that.
They won't remember your music. If this confession gets out, you live on immortal, trapped in a story you do not control, told by people who do not care about the truth. Is that really what you're asking me to do? How Salieri killed Mozart? But the truth of it? The real truth? That would die with me. I hope your audience enjoys it.
Where it's like, oh, Mozart will always have this great legacy, but you will always be known as just a footnote of that whenever your name is mentioned. And, that's the one part where I have to think back on like the actual historical nature of what actually happened. Because Salieri was a great composer. And I think it is this thing of how Mozart, I'm sure anyone that likes classical music or knows of classical music, we all grew up with Mozart. We all learned about who he was. We all know his music, and we all know what he means to the canon of music. And because his work was so strong that it overshadowed a lot of people, somewhat undeservedly. Like a lot of people don't know that Mozart had a sister, like Marianne Nanel Mozart, who, by all accounts, was just as talented as him. But of course, due to gender dynamics of the time, she got neglected in her adult years, which is just so incredibly sad to think about. So you have all these artists and all these people that were around Mozart's time, and because Mozart is someone that was so like famous or infamous, the way you would see it, like people in his life will always be seen as just lesser in comparison, which with Salieri, I don't think it's fully deserving. And I do appreciate that people are starting to turn around in listening more to Salieri, because I know like that's kind of the arc I was at, where as a child I grew up with Mozart, but as I got older, as an adult, in many ways, like much more the character Salieri in Amadeus, I became him when I grew up, and I listened to Salieri a lot more when I actually learned about him, and I grew up listening more and more to works that were beyond with Mozart. So that's the whole thing, and it is that story that, because like what the show decides to do also is try to be very metatextual about it, even more so than the other plays. It's just so what it does with this narrative, bringing back to the finale. So what this finale does is that after Costanza gives Pushkin the permission to make the play, we then see a small scene of Pushkin writing Amadeus. Then we cut to Peter Schaffer writing Amadeus. Then we cut to Milos Forman directing the movie. And then we have Salieri, who stands on, like, I guess, a modern stage. Like, he stands in front of an audience, like a modern audience. And they kind of did the whole thing of like, oh, I absolve the audience of all sins, like referencing back to how Salieri the whole time in the play was just speaking to the audience. And then he just cuts his throat. He slits his throat, and that's how the show ends. So that ending gave me a lot to think about in the worst possible way. See, like, I get it. You know, the show always dealt with this idea of a metatextual narrative, of a story, of someone telling a story about his views on a myth that is Mozart. I get that. I get why you want to try and transgress that even further by showing how far it can go. The problem is it comes in way too late, and the show as a whole, the biggest thing I can say about it is that it feels so inconsistent. I haven't even mentioned the filmmaking process, where in classic contemporary cinema fashion, a lot of it is handheld, and a lot of it's trying to go for somewhat of a realist approach, but also tries to balance this idea of what the film did, which was how Mozart perceived the world around him to inspire his music, which is working decently enough. But then you get these like dream sequences that feel like I'm watching something from Euphoria, where it's like in the mind of like Mozart or Salieri, where it's like mainly Mozart, where like, oh, it's like the dangers, and it's like it feels like hallucinogenic, and it's like he's going through this black void or some shit like that, and it's just so corny and stuff like that. And it's just like, really, the saving grace of the technical merits is the cinematography. I mean, when you have the cinematographer who worked on The Quiet Girl, like, which is a very underrated movie from a few years ago, like, of course it's gonna look good, because that film looked amazing. But yeah, it's a very odd show in just how very average yet annoyingly stupid it is. Like, everything I said about that ending, it reminds me, like, I guess why I was so angry is that it reminded me of the worst kinds of contemporary art inspired, minimalist, stupid, vulgar shows and productions of opera that are just swarming the industry right now. Like, I think about these types of things where they're so obviously trying to be provocative, and it's not funny, it's not interesting. It's like, yeah, it's like, oh, it's like, it's the whole thing of, oh, let's put in like Bizet's Carmen in space. That would be a great idea. Again, it's like, it is frustrating, and I think back to what I said all at the very beginning, where the questions that I'm sure you're having is mostly, why did I watch this? And why does it exist? I mean, it exists because like this show is being streamed right now on a network that you've never heard of, never gotten ever, because no one's gonna see it in the US. It's called Sky TV. Yeah, the most famous streaming service, Sky TV, which I'm sure everyone is gonna go and like subscribe for Amadeus. Like, this is basically their flagship show at this point. This is what's gonna determine like how successful the new streaming service is gonna be. And I love this tagline that is shown in the trailer for Sky TV.
Believe in original stories. Sky. Believe in better.
Meanwhile, your flagship show is an adaptation of a work that has been done to death many times. So what's your reinterpretation? Because even when you try to be original, it falls flat on its face and just reminds me of like either better or worse attempts of doing what you're doing. And that's basically how I feel. But the reason I watched this show, why I did, is because more than just being a Mozart fan, I guess I'm just so craving for mainstream media to acknowledge classical music in a way that is very accessible and reminds people of the beauty of that music. Because that's what the original Amadeus film was. It was a popular film, a Best Picture winner. It was like the Rock Me Amadeus song. Like, come on now. It's like, that was a film that brought a lot of people to realize like how fun and exciting classical music can be, particularly how Mozart's music was something that feels so contemporary. It always will be modern. It always will be for the youth. And that's something that is still relevant to this day. And I find myself seeing how the more classical music becomes elitist and the more people use classical music in visual mediums like cinema, they use it in a way that is so predictable and so disheartening to see of how classical music has once again been turned into just an elitist art form. More than most, I would say. Like, it's besides maybe the contemporary arts, which fitting, I guess, because of opera, modern opera now. But whenever I try and see something classical music related in cinema, I always try to. It's like, and most of the time, it usually is just so lackluster. Like, besides Todd Field's Tar, which is like barely considered like somebody would say as like a film about classical music, because again, it is an original story about a fictional composer that only references, composers and people like Mahler, Gultendater, Bach, and whatever. But the actual classical music based stuff, like, when I see shit like the Magic Flute adaptation by Roland Emmerich or Bradley Cooper's Maestro, I thought that was like so bad. But like, again, I still watch them because at least there are people in the industries that acknowledge the power of these great composers, this great music, these great artists, and they want to express that for people to always remember how beautiful this type of work can be. Like, not to say like, oh, all modern music is like terrible and like that's the reason why I'm supporting these that support classical music, because obviously I'm not someone that's purely a classical music person. I like a lot of different types of stuff. Like, I love Daft Punk. like I'm obsessed with that almost as much as Mozart. But at the same time, I do believe that classical music is in a state where like it needs to have support of realizing the power and beauty that I think many people are like slowly disregarding, even though they don't realize that classical music has been a part of our world all the way up to the present day. I can't count the many times I hear classical music in video essays, in commercials, or any sort of film that even remotely wants to convey the drama in an effective way. They always use a piece of classical music from centuries ago because in the minds of many people, they know how timeless it is and how we can't just let that go. And so when I see something that is based around classical composers and their music to try and show a form of that story to a brand new audience, and once you do that and it just fails, that leaves for something that is just, for the most part, a very disappointing, very by the numbers experience.
Perhaps it was in that moment I knew what I was going to do.
The moment you knew you were going to do what?
I was going to kill Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Yes.